The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present, by Dr. Leonard Peikoff.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset of this course on modern philosophy, I'm going to ask you to do what I ask students to do at the outset of any course on the history of philosophy which I offer, and that is to imagine for a moment that you are a psychiatrist in the business of curing neurotics, and that an intensely neurotic man has just entered your office seeking psychotherapy. Your prospective patient is a man of mixed premises. In part, there is a pro-reason, pro-reality element in him, an element which makes him want to solve his problems and enjoy life on Earth. But in part, he holds a huge cluster of irrational premises in addition, a series of contradictions and various errors which are ceaselessly clashing with his better premises and leading him willy-nilly down the road of misery, anxiety, and self-destruction. Your job is to cure him. Now, how will you go about it? Well, in essence, you would have to first understand the cause of his troubles, what exactly his bad premises are, and why he holds them, how he came to hold them. And then you would have to guide him to uproot his bad premises and substitute correct ones in their place. Now, how would you do this? Well, among other crucial things, you would have to probe the patient's past, because his present can be fully understood only as a development of and resultant from his past. Since he is one continuous entity, he builds conclusion on conclusion. You would have to understand, therefore, the crucial events in his past life and the conclusions that he drew from them. You'd have to see how and why, across the course of his development, he was led to form and accept certain errors, and then to build upon those errors, thereby compounding his original problems, progressively stifling his better premises, making himself more and more twisted, confused, helpless, mixed up. In a word, you would have to reconstruct the main points of the man's intellectual development from childhood on, to get before you a picture of his intellectual history. Now, the same principle applies to an entire culture. In this analogy, the stand-in for the intense neurotic of mixed premises is the world we all live in, Western civilization. And the stand-in for the psychiatrist is each one of us. We live in this culture. Our lives and futures depend in 1,000 ways on its future. If we live and pursue values in this world, then we have a responsibility to our own lives and values to correct the course of the world, to put it on the right track again. If you want to fight for your values in a world such as ours is today, you must in this respect regard yourself as the psychotherapist of an entire culture. And just as in the case of an individual neurotic, even more so in the case of an entire civilization. It develops across time, and its present condition at any time cannot be understood except as an outgrowth from its past. The errors of today are built on the errors of the last century, and they wouldn't be possible without them. And the errors in the last century, in turn, are built on the errors of the previous century, and so on back to the childhood of the Western world in ancient Greece. So if you want to understand exactly what are the root errors of today's world, why these errors developed, how they did, how they clashed with and are progressively submerging the good premises in today's world, if you want to understand all the incredible complexity and interactions of falsehood and truths which led step by step from Greece to today, and therefore to know what to do to completely cure the patient, you have to reconstruct the intellectual history of the Western world. Now, to use an example I've used before, but I use it again because it's very brief, you take a phenomenon like progressive education. You want to understand it, why Johnny can't read and why the teachers are busy preventing him from learning to read in accordance with a formal theory. Well, you couldn't make sense of that except by reference to John Dewey, who simply is a variant on William James, without whom you couldn't understand John Dewey. But James is an obvious development with a minor twist from a Hegel, who is obviously a development from Kant, who was trying to answer Hume, who simply drew the last final consequences from a development inaugurated by Descartes and Locke, and Descartes merely reformulated in a somewhat more secular way the basic principles of Augustine, who merely reformulated in a somewhat more religious way the basic principles of Plato, who was trying, among other things, to answer Heraclitus, and Heraclitus is where we're starting this evening. The subject, in other words, which gives you the picture of the whole history of Western development is the history of philosophy. And in this sense, the history of philosophy is like a philosophical psychotherapist's biographical report on a civilization. It's a precondition to understanding and therefore to changing the nature and present course of the civilization. And this is the primary purpose of any course on the history of philosophy. Now there is a second purpose. Almost all of the philosophic errors which are undermining the world were originally, and still today are, advanced by their supporters with a whole arsenal of arguments claiming to prove that the position in question is true. And indeed, these views couldn't have acquired the power they have over people's minds without this structure of allegedly supporting arguments to give the errors at least the appearance of plausibility, conviction, and rationality. Now, if you are to fight these errors, you have to know the main arguments advanced in favor of them. You have to hear the devil's case, so to speak, presented as strongly as his case permits, which is not often very strong, but still. You have to be sure you know on each issue what really is true and what is wrong with the arguments advanced for the erroneous position. Because if you don't have this knowledge, you are simply not able to fight successfully against the errors. And therefore, what we want to do is to present in each case, as strongly as I can, the arguments by which the various views are defended by their supporters, and then at the appropriate point, in each case where objectivism disagrees, and in the progression from Kant to the present, that is the overwhelming majority of points, indicate to you what is the objectivist criticism, what is the objectivist position, what is the objectivist answer. At the end, therefore, I hope you would have not merely an increased understanding of the causes of the state of today's world, but also a philosophic arsenal to enable you more successfully to combat what needs combating and to defend what needs defending. Now, in this course, we are starting to study the patient, that is to say Western civilization, at a quite advanced stage. Our program here is to cover the development of philosophy in the last 2 centuries, from Kant to the present. But as I've indicated, to understand the philosophy of the past 2 centuries, you have to first understand at least certain essentials of the history of philosophy in prior centuries, because that serves as the context and intellectual background necessary to make recent developments intelligible. These last 2 centuries are just like the final conclusions of a long, long argument, stretching back for millennia, back to the beginnings of Western philosophy in ancient Greece. So my assignment tonight is to present to you some of the key premises and ideas from this long chain. In other words, from the history of philosophy. So you will know the kinds of problems and theories bequeathed to Kant and his successors, the problems and the theories that profoundly influenced them, and which alone would make their own theories, approaches, and viewpoints intelligible. Now, I have 2 types of audience hearing this tonight. Some of you have taken the first half of this course from Thales to Hume, and some of you have not, are starting from scratch without any background in the history of philosophy at all. I try to satisfy both groups by the following means. For the former, I have to say you will not hear any new material tonight. The new material starts next week. So to you this evening, the lecture will serve, I hope, as a review in essential terms of the most indispensable points of the previous course to refresh your memories and prepare you to go on next week. To the people who are new and have taken no history of philosophy at all before this, be prepared, because I'm going to throw a host of ideas at you. I will do my best to make each one fully clear so that you two will be on an equal footing with the others when we officially start with Kant next week. Now, it's obviously impossible for me to give you the whole history of philosophy before Kant this evening. So what I'm going to do instead is summarize for you certain profoundly influential theories taken essentially from four different philosophers: Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, and Hume. Now, I cannot give you even of these philosophers a full account in the time we have, and even of the theories I present, I can do no more than really sketch in certain essentials. I'll have to omit most of the arguments these philosophers offer for their views, and I'll have to omit this evening any critical or evaluative comments. For further details on the theories we cover tonight, I can refer you to standard histories of philosophy, and as for critical comments, they will be interspersed at appropriate points in later lectures. I'm just going to plunge in now and give you a series of brief intellectual sketches that will be indispensable as background for the next weeks when we actually begin the systematic presentation of modern philosophy with Kant. And let us then plunge right in with the first one we're going to look at this evening, Heraclitus. Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is referred to as a pre-Socratic philosopher for the reason that he lived in the period prior to Socrates. We do not know his exact dates. It was too early for us to know exactly when he was born and died, but we know, as it's put, that he flourished around 500 BC. He was alive and kicking at that time. Only fragments of his views have survived, but they have been enormously influential. You'll see them shortly in Plato and in many other later philosophers, particularly in Hegel and Marx. So he is the first one you must know something about if you are to understand modern philosophy. Now, the central concept in Heraclitus' philosophy is the concept of change. Change. By change in philosophy is meant any action, any motion, any occurrence, any event. Any case where something happens, whether mental or physical. Now, in looking at the phenomenon of change, Heraclitus came to two crucial conclusions, and let's take them one at a time. First, he came to the conclusion that change requires the existence of contradictions. Change requires the existence of contradictions. Now, a contradiction, if it existed, would be something which is and is not at the same time and in the same respect. Something which is so and yet not so at the same time. Now, I trust you know from your readings of Objectivism the law of identity. A is A. A thing is what it is. It is itself. It is something. And that means that nothing can be A and non-A at the same time. If it's A, it's A. If it's non-A, it's non-A. Contradictions can't exist. Now, Heraclitus lived prior to the formulation of the law of identity, but nevertheless his theory of change amounted in essence to an all-out attack on the law of identity. He held that every change involved a violation of the law of identity. In other words, that every change involves the existence of a contradiction. And of course, if contradictions exist, if things are A and non-A, that would wipe out the law of identity and the basic laws of logic. Now, why did he hold this? Well, I'll give you an example that I found is helpful with classes to make this point clear. It's not his example, but it's brief, and it tends to make his point at least intelligible. It's hard fully hard to make a philosopher intelligible if he maintains avowedly that the world is riddled with contradictions, but nevertheless I'll do the best I can for him. Now consider this match, which I have just torn from this package of matches. Now I'm going to have it undergo a process of change and hopefully come out with Heraclitus's conclusion. Now this is still the same match, right, that I pulled out a minute ago. There's no sleight of hand here. I didn't throw out the original match and substitute a new one. This is still the same match. Very good. All right, now I'm going to have it still the same match, right? Nothing has changed. Now I'm going to have it go through a process of change, and still the same match, right? All right. Have it go through a process of change, same match, and see what happens. Here it's going to go through a process of change. Now for the people on the tape, I'm now making this match undergo a process of change. It has just now obviously gone under a process of change because the tip is hot, and it used to be cool, and it's black, and it used to be white. I've just lit it, right? Now, it's still the same match, right? I didn't substitute a new one. But, says Heraclitus, while it is the same match, it is also not the same match. It is different because it has changed. It has changed. It is still there after the change, the same match, so it's still the same. But since it has changed, it is different. It is not the same. It's the same and not the same. And what could that be, he asks, but a contradiction. Now he generalized in the following way. A changing thing endures throughout the change. It's still there at the end of the change. That's how we distinguish a changing thing from simply the obliteration of one entity and the substitution of a new entity. So at the end of a change, the thing is still the same thing. But since it's changed, it's obviously not the same. It's different. Conclusion he drew, it is and is not the same, which is a contradiction. Now, he thought, since everything is changing, it follows that everything is thoroughly contradictory. Everything is A and non-A. It is and isn't what it was, but also what it wasn't, and what it will and won't become. Now that is Heraclitus's first point with regard to change. In a moment we'll see what Aristotle's answer to that point was. Let us look now at his second main point in regard to change. You got point one. Point one is change involves a contradiction, he claims. Now to introduce the second point, I have to tell you that the philosophers of Heraclitus' time were all trying to find a metaphysical common denominator. In other words, something uniting everything which exists, something which is true of everything which is. Heraclitus looked for this common denominator also and claimed to find it in the process of change itself. Change, he claimed, was the key to reality. It was the basic metaphysical phenomenon. The only thing true of everything that exists, he said, is it is constantly changing. Now, since he made change metaphysical, that is true of everything, built into the essence of reality as such, then obviously nothing could be exempt from change. So everything Heraclitus held is changing. Everything is changing. In every respect, at every instant. Nothing ever remains the same in any way, in any respect, for 2 consecutive instants. Now, we just have fragments from Heraclitus, but as far as we can tell, he took this seriously. And he drew from it the conclusion that there are no such things as entities. There are no entities. Now, by entity, we mean essentially what we mean in ordinary language by the word thing: a mountain, a planet, a person, a table. All of these are what we mean by entity or thing. And to the ordinary non-Heraclitean, the ordinary person, it seems that the world is filled with things, filled with entities. According to Heraclitus, there are no entities at all, only change. Entities are an illusion, a deception caused by the inadequacy of man's senses. The senses, said Heraclitus, are invalid. To our gross, crude senses, it appears that there are entities which endure across time, he said. But that is simply because our senses are not subtle enough to detect the constant, ceaseless change. In reality, he claimed, there are no entities. Everything is changing in every respect at every instant. As his followers put it, everything is flux, meaning constant change. And if you try to find an entity in this flux, you simply can't do it. Now you say, well, now what about this table that I'm pointing to? Isn't that as clear an example as you could get of an entity, a thing, a nice, quiet, solid, stable, peaceful, clear-cut, unavoidable thing? Heraclitus's followers say absolutely not. It too is in flux. It is constantly changing in every respect. And by the time you want to say about this, it is, you no sooner get the it out than it's gone in the flux and it isn't anymore. Now the best way, in fact the only way I found to make this clear, is to read from one commentator who gives the best presentation of this Heraclitean point. He's expounding on Heraclitus's famous line, you can't step in the same river twice, because everything is constantly changing. And he says, I'm quoting this modern commentator, no man can ever step twice into the same river. How could he? The second time he tried to step, new waters would have flowed down from upstream. The water would not be the same. Neither would the bed and banks be the same, for the constant erosion would have changed them too. And if the river is the water, the bed, and the banks, the river is not the same river. Now get the next sentence. Strictly speaking, there is no river. What common opinion names a river, it supposes that the name applies to something that will remain there for a time at least. But the river remains there no time at all. It has changed while you pronounce its name. There is no river. Worse yet, you cannot step into the same river twice because you are not there twice. You too change, and the person who stepped the first time no longer exists to step the second time. Persons do not exist either. For when anyone says that something exists, the meaning is that that something does not change, at least for a short time. An object that is real must be an object that stands still. Suppose a clever sculptor takes a lump of a children's modeling clay and begins to work it rapidly. It shortly takes on the appearance of a child's teddy bear, and if the sculptor should stop, we could call it a teddy bear. But he doesn't stop. His nimble fingers keep working, and the momentary bear turns into a small statue of Zeus, only quickly to disappear into the form of the Empire State Building. Well, what is it, you ask? You can't say it's a bear, or a god, or a building. Under these circumstances, all you could say is, it's modeling clay. And you can call it clay because the clay remains the same throughout the changes. But suppose now the clay itself never remained the same. If it changed from clay to wax to paper mache and never stopped changing, we could call it nothing. Nothing. That is, it does not exist. It is unreal. Unquote. That is as clear as I have ever heard Heraclitus made. He expresses it himself, Heraclitus, in two famous aphorisms. Everything flows, nothing abides. That's one. And the other is, nothing is, everything is becoming. So for Heraclitus, in sum, that's the second point I wanted to make. For Heraclitus, in sum, this world in which we live is a stream of change and contradictions. Everything is melting and fusing into everything else. There are no entities, no identity, simply a seething, boiling, shiftless, restless, transitory, contradictory flux. Now, this sort of universe, which has two characteristics: there are no things in it, and whatever there is in it, namely change, is riddled with contradictions, is referred to as a Heraclitean flux. And it is Heraclitus' contribution to metaphysics. Now, I may say that on the basis of this view, one of Heraclitus' disciples, namely Cratylus, stopped talking altogether. He just remained mute. And his reasoning, which I gather he elaborated before he stopped talking, was that words could have no meaning on this philosophy, since what you refer to is swept away in the flux before you get the word out. Since there are no things, there's nothing for words to refer to. If I start to say the word table, and I just get the thing is gone in the flux, and consequently I can't speak. And according to Aristotle's account, Cratylus therefore remained completely mute thereafter, and periodically wagged his finger to indicate that someone, presumably non-Heracliteans, should bring him food. Well, now I want to tonight stuff you with falsehoods at a torrential rate to get you prepared for Kant, so let us leave Heraclitus now. And let us turn to Plato, who was heavily influenced by Heraclitus. Cratylus was one of Plato's teachers. Plato's dates are 427 to 347 BC. He is the first philosopher to have a complete system of philosophy. That is, metaphysics, a view of reality; epistemology, a theory of how knowledge is acquired; ethics, a theory of how man should live; politics, a theory of the proper functions of government. Now, I should say, for accuracy, Plato was influenced by many other pre-Socratics besides Heraclitus, but for our purposes this evening, I'm going to ignore all these others and develop the essentials of Plato's view simply by picking up where Heraclitus left off. Now, Plato agreed with Heraclitus on many crucial points. He agreed that this world in which we live is a stream of change without entities. He agreed that this world in which we live is riddled with contradictions. He agreed that our senses are invalid and do not yield a knowledge of reality. So on all those respects, Plato was a good Heraclitean. But he drew from these views a momentous conclusion that Heraclitus himself had not drawn. Namely, Plato concluded that this world in which we live is not real, that true reality is another realm or dimension, a realm which transcends this world, a supernatural world diametrically opposite to the world revealed to us by our senses. And his reasoning, to condense it to its essence, was in effect like this: if there are no entities in this world, there must be another world where we can find stable, enduring entities. If change involves a contradiction, which he granted, he said, well, but contradictions can't exist in true reality. And therefore, true reality must be a realm without change. It must consist of completely immutable, completely motionless, changeless, and therefore consistent, non-contradictory entity. And he reasoned, since our senses are invalid, if true reality is to be knowable, it can't be the kind of world that is known by the senses. In other words, it can't be physical or material in nature, because if it were physical, you could only know it by the senses, and yet the senses are invalid. So if knowledge of reality is to be possible, he concluded, reality must be completely non-sensory, non-physical, non-material, knowable by some means completely different from sense perception. In short, he concluded, true reality must be composed of a set of immutable, which means unchanging, immutable, non-material entities. Well, now this raises the question, what sort of entities comprises true reality in Plato's opinion? We know they have to be non-material and they have to be unchanging, but what are they? Well, to understand Plato's answer, I have to first introduce you to what is perhaps the major issue in the history of philosophy. What is called the issue of universals, So just hold on to Plato for a moment while we take a look at the issue of universals, and then we'll come back to Plato's other world. And first, let us simply get our terminology clear. The Greek philosophers, that includes Plato and Aristotle, distinguish between what they called universal and what they called particular. Universal versus, or as distinct from, particular. For instance, in this room we have a number of particular men. This particular man, this one, this one, this one. Now, they said there is something in common among all of these men, on the basis of which we classify them all together. And the thing in common among them all is what they meant by the universal. And in English, you normally indicate the universal by adding some suffix like ness or hood to the word. So the universal in this case would be manness. Manness being the name for those properties which run through all individual men and on the basis of which we classify them all together. Now, obviously, wherever we have an abstract term, it stands for a whole group of particulars on the basis of a certain set of common properties which run through them. In other words, on the basis of a certain universal. So I could point to one chair and another chair and another chair. Those are three particulars. And you would tell me, if I asked you the universal is, call it chair hood if you want. And if I say the IRT and the BMT and the IND, those are three particular subways, and they all have something in common. Let's call it the universal subway hood, and so on for as many examples as you want. Now, both Plato and Aristotle argue that the thing that distinguishes man from the animals is man's capacity to grasp universals. They said the animals can perceive particulars, a particular man or a particular chair or even a particular subway, just as well as man and even better. But what is man's distinctive cognitive capacity? What is it that makes him a rational, conceptual being? That he can grasp universals, common denominators, linking particulars. They said that's what it means to conceptualize. And that's what enables man to classify, to generalize, to grasp laws which are applicable to all the particulars in a class rather than just the ones he's observed, and thereby to make predictions about the future and control his environment. They said if you took away from man this faculty of grasping universals, you'd be back in the position of simply animals who perceive particulars but can't abstract, and therefore can't draw conclusions, formulate principles, but merely react blindly. So, for instance, a given dog, Fido, might like a number of particular bones. He might really enjoy them and get a great deal of dog pleasure out of it. But why does it never occur to him to say, well, where did bones come from? What's the source of bones? Why don't I start a bone store or a bone expedition in order to increase my store of them? And they would say, in essence, the answer is the poor dog can't get boneness. He can't get the idea of what is in common among all the particulars, and consequently he's restricted to reacting to one concrete, one particular, wagging his tail and then forgetting it and going on about his business till he hits the next one, and is devoid of the human capacity. Now, if you get this distinction between universals and particulars, Many philosophers regard the phenomenon of universals as posing a serious problem, and it is called the problem of universals. And the problem is simply this: where are universals? Where are they? Or put it another way, how do they exist? Now we can come back to Plato, who was the first philosopher to have a theory of universals, and you will see how it fits into what I said earlier. Plato argued like this. He said, I never encounter universals in this physical world in which we live. All I ever find in this world, he said, is particulars. I look around me, he said, I see this man, that other man, in other words, the particulars, but I never see manness. I see this shade of red, and that shade of red, and that other shade of red. I never see redness as such, the universal, and so on. Particulars, he claimed, were physical or material, and therefore you could grasp them by the senses. But universals, he said, can't be grasped by the senses. If they could be grasped by the senses, then animals should be able to grasp them, but they can't. So, universals are not graspable by the senses, and therefore, he said, they must be non-material, because if they're material, we should be able to grasp them by the senses, but we can't. So he said there's a radical difference between universals and particulars. Particulars are physical, graspable by the senses. Universals are non-physical, non-graspable by the senses. And beyond that, particulars, he said, constantly changed, but universals don't change. For instance, a given individual man comes into existence, grows, undergoes a process of constant change, dies, decays. He's like a Heraclitean flux. But manness, what it is to be a man, he argued, the universal manness goes on untouched, and it's still exactly what it was in ancient Greece. Or to vary the example, individual triangles, for instance, drawn on a blackboard, come into existence, and they wear away, and they're brushed off, and then they die, they're gone. But triangularity goes on unchanged forever, and if we prove a theorem about triangularity in ancient Greece, that same theorem remains true to this day. Conclusion he came to: universals are immutable, particulars are constantly changing. And then again he said, particulars in any given class are many. There's a great many individual men, a great many individual triangles. But in each class there's only one universal, one manness, one triangularity, etc. From all these points, and I've just hinted at them, he concluded that universals and particulars have radically different characteristics. One is grasped by the senses, one isn't. One is material, one isn't. One is changing, one is immutable. One is many in each class, one is one. Consequently, he said, they must form two radically different worlds. Universals must exist in a world of their own. And that world is commonly today called the world of Platonic forms, with a capital F, which simply means the world of universals. And it contains a universal for every set of particulars down here. So, according to Plato, manness is up there, triangularity, subwayhood, the whole works. Wherever you have particulars here, you have a universal in the world of forms, as it's called. And by this means, Plato thought that he could answer Heraclitus. The Heracliteans say this world is a world of flux, and we can't even speak in this world. Plato says, true, but there is an immutable, knowable world, and that is the world of universals. The Heracliteans say, this world in which we live is contradictory because it's constantly changing. Plato says, true, but there is a non-contradictory reality, namely the motionless world of universals. Heraclitus and his followers say we can't trust the senses. And Plato says, true, But there is a non-material world that we can know by non-sensory means, the world of forms. So, a supernatural realm of universals is Plato's solution to the problems of earlier philosophy. Now, what is the status of this world, the physical world, for Plato, the world in which we live? Well, he says it is merely a reflection, a byproduct or projection of the world of universals. The forms, the universals, he says, are true reality. And I may say he also thought they were absolutely perfect. As one commentator put it, the form of the bed, the universal bedness, had no lumps in its mattress. It was an absolutely perfect bedness. Whereas this world in which we live, he held is imperfect. It's a distorted copy or projection of the world of forms. Now, if you want an analogy to help you keep it in mind, I'll give you one of my own which might be helpful. Imagine that you are standing, projecting into an amusement park mirror. Now, I say an amusement park mirror because it has to have a distorted, twisted surface, so you get a twisted, distorted reflection of you. There's the perfect you, but the distorted reflection. And now add that that mirror in which you are shining is many-faceted. It's broken up into separate segments, so that although there's only one you looking in the mirror see a great many separate reflections. And now suppose someone is there with a crank turning these sections of the mirror, so it looks as though these little shadowy images are moving around frantically, engaged in constant motion, even though the reality, namely you, are standing there motionless. So you would have, in this analogy, the reality is single, but the image is multiple. The reality is perfect, the image is distorted. The reality is motionless, the image is in constant motion. Well, for Plato, that is essentially the relation of true reality to our physical world. The physical world is just a set of multiple, whirling, distorted images given off by the true, motionless, non-material reality, the world of forms. Now, that is a brief summary of Plato's metaphysics, his view of reality, and it is technically referred to as a metaphysics of idealism. Now, idealism, as that term is used in philosophy, is the metaphysical view that reality is fundamentally spiritual or non-material in nature. And Plato is the first famous idealist, the first really major influential idealist in the history of philosophy, because his world of universals is non-material, and you will find when you get to Hegel that this is indispensable to understand, because Hegel is also an idealist. Hegel, however, is not a Platonic idealist. As you can guess, he is referred to as a Hegelian idealist, but the idea of idealism is common to both, and this background, I hope, will help you with it. Now a word on Plato's epistemology, his theory of the means by which knowledge is acquired. Now, Plato was very concerned to combat the skeptics of his time, who said that knowledge is impossible. And Plato believed that knowledge is possible. He was a firm advocate of the view that we can achieve certainty, absolute certain knowledge. Not, of course, of this world in which we live, because this world is a Heraclitean flux, it's contradictory, it isn't really real. So he agreed with the skeptics you couldn't achieve knowledge of this world, but nevertheless of true reality, of the world of forms or universals. But the question is, how? He had to confront the question, how can we here on earth, limited by our senses and our bodies, ever come into contact with the perfect non-material world of forms or universals? Well, Plato's answer is that in this life, we have no direct means of contacting the forms. But he says that is not a problem, because our souls existed prior to this life and inhabited the world of forms. And at that time, each of our souls actually came in contact with and knew all universals, and therefore all laws, all principles. They were actually, in effect, omniscient, each of our souls in this previous life. And all of that knowledge is still in each one of us now. Now, of course, we may not be conscious of the knowledge that we possess, or at least of great portions of it, but, says Plato, that's simply because, in effect, owing to the trauma of being born in a physical body and plunged in the midst of this Heraclitean flux, we have temporarily forgotten our knowledge of the forms. But it's real, and it's there in the soul of each one of us. And all we have to do to acquire knowledge is dig out of us the knowledge that we are actually born with. So acquiring knowledge is really a process of remembering what we knew in a previous life. And this is Plato's theory of knowledge as reminiscence. Knowledge as reminiscence. Notice, therefore, that Plato believes in innate knowledge, innate ideas, which means knowledge of reality born in us. And in his opinion, we acquired this knowledge in a previous life. He does not, therefore, believe that the senses are a means to acquire new knowledge of reality. Now, of course, he thinks the senses have a function. He would not advocate gouging out your eyes, piercing your ears, and generally obliterating your sensory apparatus. He says the function of the senses is to serve as a stimulus to jog our memories and thereby enable us to remember what we had learned in a previous life. You have to imagine, for instance, just as an analogy, that you had gone to someone into high school with someone who was a friend of yours, and a high school picture was taken in your yearbook, and then it molded in the attic for 40 years, and you forgot completely this person. And if I mentioned the person's name, you wouldn't remember it. But one day you're going through the attic, and you see this picture. Now, this picture is now so vague and so blurred and so imperfect that if you didn't know the person originally, you could just look at it and you'd get nothing out of it. But since you carry the knowledge around in you subconsciously, you look at this picture, and it serves as a stimulus to say, oh, yes, I remember Smith now. I haven't thought of him for years. Well, in essence, for Plato, that is the process by which we acquire all knowledge. You see a number of individual men. Since they are Heraclitean, unreal, contradictory, imperfect, if we had no knowledge at birth, we would just gaze at them helplessly. But because we have the knowledge of madness, after we see a few, we snap our fingers mentally, we say, oh yes, now I remember madness. Comes back to you from the preceding life, and by that means you resurrect the knowledge you're born with. But after a certain initial stimulation from the senses, knowledge thereafter for Plato is acquired essentially by introspection. We turn away from the world, we look inward and attempt to discover the truths, the laws, the universals that are born into us, and proceed to deduce their consequences. Now, a theory of knowledge of this kind is called rationalism. Rationalism. As Plato advocated, rationalism is the view that knowledge can be acquired solely by reasoning from innate concepts. The view that knowledge can be acquired solely by reasoning from innate concepts, and that sense perception is in principle dispensable. That is the view of Platonic rationalism. It's called rationalism because Plato called the faculty which study universals reason. And therefore his view was we can acquire all knowledge by reason, and the senses are in principle dispensable. So rationalism is the idea that reason alone, in other words, independent of the senses, as apart from their role as an initial stimulus, reason alone can give us all knowledge. And we will encounter rationalism again shortly this evening, and you will see it again in several forms in modern philosophy post-Kant. Now, it's not our province this evening to go into ethics or politics. You can probably imagine the trend of Plato's ethics, given the metaphysics and epistemology that I've so far presented. His ethics are profoundly otherworldly, supernaturalistic, ascetic. They involve being anti-matter, anti-money, anti-pleasure, anti-sex. He's obviously an advocate of what has come to be called Platonic love. His whole philosophy is in fact the foundation for a religious view of the universe. In the subsequent history of philosophy, his world of universals coalesced into the Christian God and actually gave rise to the subsequent religious philosophy with the ethics that involves. But we're not going to pursue that any further tonight. Are you ready for now number 3 on the parade this evening? I want to turn to certain ideas of Aristotle. 384 to 322 BC. Now, he was for a long time a pupil of Plato's, and nevertheless, he ultimately became the author of a philosophy that was profoundly opposed to Plato's. Now, again, it's impossible for me to do more now than summarize just a few key themes. Unfortunately, you do not have to know a great deal of Aristotle to understand the development of philosophy from Kant to the present, because he was not very influential during that period. But certain things I will tell you just so you know there was something other than Plato in the history of philosophy. And first, a few themes from Aristotle's Metaphysics. Heraclitus had said, there is no reality. Nothing is. There are no entities, only the flux. Plato said there's 2 realities. Now, as against both of them, Aristotle says there's only one reality, namely the world in which we live. He holds against Heraclitus that this world is a world of firm entities, each with a specific nature, each completely obedient to the law of identity. So he's completely opposed to Heraclitus with his idea of no entities and with constant contradictions. And, of course, against Plato, Aristotle denies that there is any supernatural world of universals. Now, let's take his objections to each of these very briefly in order. He thought Heraclitus was completely wrong in his view that change implies a contradiction, and he denied that viewpoint completely. Aristotle, of course, was the first to formulate and name the law of contradiction, which says that nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. Aristotle said Heraclitus simply did not understand the process of change. The process of change, he says, is the process of certain materials taking on a new structure or organization, and therefore new properties. No contradiction, he said, at all is involved. When that match, for instance, changes, the same basic materials remain at the end of the change, but they are differently organized in certain respects at the end. The match at the end of the change, he said, is the same in one respect, that is to say, in respect of its basic materials, but it's different in another respect, namely the particular structure or organization of the materials at its tip. So it is the same and different, but in 2 different respects. And he says this is in no way a contradiction. The law of contradiction says you can't have A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. This is not such a thing. This would be an example of A in one respect and non-A in another. And therefore, he says that doesn't prove anything about contradiction. Further, he says against Heraclitus, the very phenomenon of change presupposes the law of identity. Change is change from something to something, from one identity to another identity. If there's no identity, if nothing is anything, if everything is riddled with contradictions, and it is and it isn't, and it's nothing in particular, how can you have change, he asks? Change of what? From what? To what? If nothing is anything, there's no such phenomenon as change. So far from change conflicting with the law of identity, he said it requires it. As for Heraclitus' idea that reality is a stream of change without any entities, Aristotle denies this completely. He says there can be no change apart from the entity which is doing the changing. Change is always the change of some entity. Take away the entity, he said, and you make change impossible, because there's then nothing to change. Imagine I told you that downstairs in the lobby there was a great deal of running. And you said to me, who's running? And I said, there's nobody there. The room is empty, only the running. Well, you'd say that's obviously impossible. You can't have running without the thing which runs, without the entity. And the same is true for falling, eating, swimming, burning, digesting, etc. Change, said Aristotle, is simply the name for what entities do. And therefore the existence of entities is a precondition of the existence of change. And so he concludes Heraclitus is completely wrong. It's a world of entities and of identity. True, things change, but they change lawfully, logically, in accordance with their natures. Now, what does he have to say to Plato's theory of another world of immutable universals? Well, his writings are filled with a polemic against Plato's view, which he thought was fantastic. To give you just one of his criticisms, he says, Plato's theory is baldly self-contradictory. What Plato does, he says, is take the universal and turn it into a concrete individual thing. In other words, turn it into a particular. And that wipes out the whole distinction between universal and particular. Plato thinks there's one man, Socrates, and another man, Aristotle, and another man, Plato, and over and above that, another thing, manness, in another world as a separate self-enclosed particular. Well, Aristotle said he fails to grasp the whole meaning of the distinction between universal and particular. A particular, he said, means a self-contained, self-enclosed thing, a thing which exists in itself. This thing, this thing, this thing. The universal, he said, is by definition what is common to a number of particulars. It's the common denominator running through a whole group. It's the set of characteristics possessed by many particulars. So it doesn't exist by itself as a particular thing. It exists only in particulars. If you make it into a separate entity, you make it into a particular, which, he said, is blatantly self-contradictory. Well, what is Plato's error? Why did Plato commit this error, he asked. And he says Plato confuses abstractions with entities. By a process of thought, says Aristotle, we can abstract, we can separate in our mind the common characteristics running through a group from their individual differences. I can look at a whole bunch of individual men, ignore the things which differ about them, and simply focus my attention on the identical common denominator which does run through them. And thereby I can form an idea of what's in common by ignoring individual differences. But just because I can think of that common denominator without the individual differences, because I can separate it mentally, doesn't mean that therefore this common denominator can exist by itself in reality, apart from these differences. The fact that you can separate something by an act of abstraction, he said, by a mental separation, doesn't mean that therefore it can be separated in reality and have an existential separation. I can show you, for instance, a number of different patches of red of different shapes and tell you, ignore the shape and focus just on the color. And you can make that mental separation. You can abstract away from the shape and focus simply on the color. But now, because you can separate the shape from the color in your mind, that doesn't mean you can come to the conclusion, therefore, red can exist without any shape at all. In reality, any particular instance of red has to have some particular shape. You can't go from the statement, I can separate it in my mind, to therefore it can be separate in reality. Otherwise, you are turning an abstraction into a thing. And this, he says, is a basic fallacy, which he claims is the essence of Plato's error. Well, what then is Aristotle's own position on universals? Well, he holds they do exist. They are real, but they only exist in particulars. Every particular, he says, has two aspects or two elements. Every particular has two aspects or two elements. On the one hand, there is something unique about every particular, something distinctive to it, something which makes it this particular. So, for instance, there's something about this table which makes it this table and distinguishes it from that one and from every other one. There's something about each of you, says Aristotle, which makes you unique, which makes you irreplaceable, which makes you this person rather than any other one. And this element, the element which makes you unique, we can refer to as the individuating element. That's present in every particular, some element which individuates or makes it unique. But he goes on, there must also be an element that a particular shares in common with other things, on the basis of which we can classify it and say it's a certain kind of thing. And this is the element which gives it a certain nature, which makes it not only this, but a certain kind of thing. This man, this table. And once we say man, we designate those attributes which are common to all men. Or this table, those attributes which are common to all tables. So according to Aristotle, everything is a this such. In other words, a particular of a certain kind. An individual belonging to a certain class. What we call the universal, he says, is merely the name for one of these two elements in a particular. It's the name for the aspect that runs identically through all the members of a class, on the basis of which we put them all together. Now notice that definition. For Aristotle, I repeat because we're going to cash in on this in a few minutes, the universal is the aspect of a particular which runs identically through all the members of a class and on the basis of which we put them all together into one class. So the universal is real for him. It's one element in the particular. But it's separable only in thought by a process of abstraction. In reality, all that exists are particulars with the universal as one aspect of it. Now, just to introduce you to a little more terminology, Plato's theory of universals is referred to as realism because it holds that universals are real. But it is called Platonic realism because it holds that they are real in the way Plato said, that is, as entities in a supernatural world. Aristotle's theory of universals is also called realism because he holds that universals are real, but it is called Aristotelian realism because it holds that they are real only as aspects of particulars. Now, I think you can see that Aristotle's theory of universals is immeasurably superior to Plato's. It is, in a way, the common sense view of universals, although, as you will see as the course develops, there are certain very definite real difficulties in Aristotle's view as he formulated it. But in any event, reality for Aristotle is to conclude the world in which we live. It's not a stream of change. It's not a distorted reflection of another dimension. It's a world of firm, solid entities which act in accordance with their natures and which can be grasped and understood by man. Now, just a brief word on Aristotle's epistemology. Of course, he rejected Plato's theory of innate ideas. The mind at birth, he said, is a tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, which means a blank slate or a blank tablet at birth. In other words, it's empty of any content at the beginning. Where does knowledge come from? Well, says Aristotle, all knowledge is based on and derived from the evidence of the senses. In other words, from experience, as it's put. And this viewpoint, which contrasts with rationalism, it comes to be called empiricism. E-M-P-I-R-I-C-I-S-M. Empiricism is the view that all knowledge is based on the evidence of the senses. And it is the position of Aristotle in contrast to Plato's idea that the senses are dispensable and that knowledge can be acquired simply via innate ideas. Aristotle held that the senses are perfectly valid. They give us direct evidence of reality, and he thought the development of knowledge consists of beginning with sense experience, then by a process of abstraction forming concepts which permit us to organize our sensory data, and then proceeding on to the development of science by a combination of induction and deduction, guided at each step of our reasoning by the laws of logic, which, as you know, Aristotle was the first person to define. Now, he made an enormous number of crucial discoveries in the field of epistemology, all of which I passed by in this speeding summary. All you have to know for now is that he challenged Plato's mysticism and worked out at least certain basic principles of rational epistemology, specifying how to acquire knowledge strictly on the basis of sense experience and reasoning on its basis. Now, again, his ethics is not our province this evening, but I could just indicate in a word that he attempts in ethics to be this worldly, in contrast to Plato. He holds, Aristotle does, that happiness and personal self-fulfillment on earth is the goal of the good life. He stresses the importance of living by reason, of using your mind to the full if you're to achieve happiness, and he even holds pride when you have earned it to be, in his phrase, the crown of the virtues. In other words, he has an ethics basically opposed to Plato's, as you would expect from the fundamental difference in their metaphysics and epistemology. Now you've had a lightning survey of certain high points in Greek philosophy. Now we are going to jump across centuries and centuries in which nothing of very crucial philosophic importance occurred. We will omit the Dark Ages. We will omit the Middle Ages. The central philosophic fact in this whole period was, of course, the dominance of Christianity. Its rise, takeover, and then its fall. And we'll pick up our story again with the emergence of modern philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries. But let us first take a break. We're turning now to the 17th and 18th centuries as the immediate background of Kant. Now, during these 2 centuries, 2 basically opposed philosophic schools developed, and they came to be called the rationalists versus the empiricists. The rationalists were centrally in the continent of Europe, and so they are called the continental rationalists. The empiricists were largely in the British Isles, and they are called the British empiricists. The conflict between these 2 schools forms the direct background of Kant's philosophy. He claimed to find the solution once and for all to their disputes, and therefore you have to know something about these schools if we're going to understand Kant next week. Now about the rationalists, I have to say very little is required this evening. They were a group of philosophers, the most famous being Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, who were in basic agreement with Plato's general approach to philosophy. There were many differences among them, but they generally held that the senses were invalid, that the world we perceive by the senses is not true reality, that true reality is a non-material, supernatural world of some sort. And usually it was a realm quite similar to Plato's world of universals. In epistemology, the rationalists were staunch believers in innate ideas. The essential process of acquiring knowledge, they held, was not looking out at the world and beginning with sensory data and then going on to form conceptual conclusions, but rather looking inward, introspecting, finding one's innate stock of ideas and principles, and then deducing their consequences. The main difference that they had with Plato on the question of the source of these innate ideas was that they disagreed with Plato's theory that we got these innate ideas by reminiscence of a previous life. The modern rationalists were Christian, and they were therefore prohibited from believing that the soul had existed prior to the body. That was an article of Christian dogma, that the soul could exist after the body's death, but not before the body. And so most of the rationalists simply substituted God for a previous life as the source of man's innate ideas. So their theory was that as God turns out each soul, He in effect sticks into it certain basic concepts and truths, enough to give the individual a base to get started once he reaches a certain age. And their innate ideas, they claimed, are guaranteed to be true of reality because, as Descartes put it, God is not a deceiver, he's perfect, and therefore he wouldn't give us ideas which are false. Now you can imagine the philosophic results of this kind of approach. There were profound disagreements among the rationalists as to what were the innate ideas that were given us by God and guaranteed by him. And the result was each started with his own arbitrary set of principles. Of course, he wouldn't say it's arbitrary. He vociferously claimed that it was a heritage from God. And each of them, dispensing with sensory evidence, proceeded to deduce the consequence from whatever they took as the infallible starting points. Whenever a philosopher's conclusions conflicted with the direct testimony of the senses, the philosopher simply wrote off sensory testimony as invalid, as deceptive, and proceeded about his business. Now, by this method, you can imagine, numbers of imposing philosophic systems were constructed, but all of them were floating in the air. All of them contradicted the others. None of them had very much contact with the actual world that men experience. Now, this approach, which amounts to the manipulating of concepts cut off from sense experience, is obviously hopeless. And the school of empiricists reacted violently against it. They announced that they were the champions of sense experience. They declared that man was, this is the empiricists, they declared that man was born tabula rasa, he has no innate ideas, that all knowledge must be based on and derived from sense experience. Now, this approach will sound much more sensible to you. It'll sound like Aristotle's approach. And I may say that among the early empiricists, people like, for instance, Francis Bacon or even John Locke in certain moods, there are definite Aristotelian elements to be found. However, the empiricists quickly began to develop in a direction diametrically opposite to Aristotle's, so that by the time you reach the climax of empiricism in the 18th century, and the climax is David Hume, you can no longer find any Aristotelianism left in the empiricist movement. As the rationalists were turning mystical with their superior realities and God-given truths, the empiricists were turning skeptical. And they ended with Hume declaring that nobody could know anything, that knowledge is impossible, that everything is arbitrary, that all so-called knowledge is simply a matter of taste, and there's no way to distinguish a sane man from a lunatic. As Bertrand Russell correctly in this respect summarized Hume's philosophy, the lunatic who believes he's a poached egg is just as justified or unjustified as everybody else in his particular beliefs, because on Hume's philosophy, complete skepticism rules, and nobody can know anything, even that you're not a poached egg. Now, that is obviously a dead end in philosophy, and that's the position Kant claimed he was going to answer. So what we have to see for this evening is, how did such virulent skepticism develop out of empiricism? And again, the crucial issue involved lies in the theory of universals. To understand what happened to the empiricists, you have to understand that most of them vehemently attacked and rejected Aristotle's theory of universals. They substituted one of their own, a third theory of universals, neither Plato's nor Aristotle's, a theory which of necessity led them to complete skepticism. And this third theory is called nominalism, Nominalism. I'll explain the name in a few minutes. Nominalism. It was subscribed to by almost all the leading empiricists in the 17th and 18th centuries, including Thomas Hobbes, John Locke in many moods, Bishop Berkeley. Locke is a mixture of everything, so you have to keep qualifying. Bishop Berkeley was an avowed empiricist, and so was David Hume. Now let's try to develop nominalism and make that theory intelligible? Well, the nominalists begin by raising all sorts of objections to Plato's and Aristotle's theory of universals. Now, their objections to Plato are obvious. We don't have to take time looking at them. Obviously, if you believe that all knowledge has to be based on sensory evidence, you're never going to justify a world of supernatural universals. So the nominalists simply threw out Plato's world of universals without a qualm, and in that they were, of course, perfectly justified. Much more important is their objection to Aristotle's theory. Now, you remember Aristotle had held that there are certain common denominators which run identically through all the members of a class. And these common denominators, what he called universals, are the objective basis for human concepts. When we grasp a concept, we abstract away from all particular instances and focus simply on the identical common denominator that's left. The nominalists said this couldn't be done. They claimed, in essence, that there are no universals at all, that there is nothing the same among all the members of a class, that every particular is completely unique, that there is therefore no metaphysical basis for our classifications. In a word, that all human concepts are arbitrary and subjective. Now, how did they defend this view? Well, they had a whole arsenal of arguments against Aristotle, but I'm going to give you just one, sufficient to give you at least the flavor of their approach. Now, I myself call this, but it's not its recognized name, I call this the I can't find it argument. And it goes like this. Aristotle had said that there is something the same, something identical, in all the particulars in a given class, and that you can discover this same element by simply ignoring the things that differ from particular to particular. And what's left will then be the common denominator, the universal. The typical nominalist says, when I do what Aristotle said, there's nothing left for me to focus my attention on. When I ignore the differences among particulars in order to be able to zero in on just the thing that's the same, I don't find anything. Now, for instance, a typical nominalist will say, take men. Aristotle says, well, just leave out of your mind everything that varies from man to man, and what's left is what's the same, namely manners. Well, a typical nominalist will say, okay, I'll leave out height. I can't keep height in my awareness because height varies from man to man. And I'm supposed to leave out everything that varies. So my idea of manness, when I arrive at it, can't have any height. Can it have any weight? No, because, of course, weight varies from person to person, so that isn't the same throughout, so I have to throw out weight. Can I leave in hair? No, of course, hair color varies. Even the existence of hair varies. The length of hair varies. The shape of hair varies, etc. So I have to throw out hair. Can I leave in intelligence? No, because that varies all the way from Einstein to Freshman and back, and even below. In other words, they say, men vary in every respect. Every particular is particular. If we strip away everything particular about a particular in order allegedly to reveal a kernel of something identical or running through them all, we can't find anything. All we have left is a blank. We can't find the unvarying common denominator. Now, I'll give you an example from a contemporary nominalist whom we will be discussing in a much later lecture, namely Ludwig Wittgenstein. He gives the famous example of game, the universal game. You know, baseball games and so on and so on. And here is a classic passage expressing this nominalist view. I'm taking him out of order here, but just to give you the idea of nominalism. His thesis is, you see, he can't find anything running through all games that make them games. Quote, consider, for instance, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Now, don't say there must be something common or they wouldn't be called games, I'm quoting. But look and see whether there's anything common to them all. And if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their multifarious relationships. He means like Monopoly and Parcheesi and so on. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When we next pass to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are all games amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses, X's and O's. Is there always winning and losing or competition between players? Think of patience, solitaire as you'd call it. In ball games, there's winning and losing. But when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of games like Ring Around Rosies. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many, many other groups of games in the same way, unquote. Now that's a typical nominalist analysis. And if he wants to get a little wilder, he'll say, and what about, isn't life a game, and sex a game, and philosophy a game, and so on? Now what is in common between life, sex, philosophy, Parcheesi, baseball, and Ring Around Rosies? There is nothing in common, nothing identical running through them all. In other words, if there is no universal gameness. Now, if you are an ingenious enough nominalist, you can do this not only with man and game, but with every term. And so I don't have to multiply examples. I think the point is clear. The upshot of it is a third theory of universals, which is very simple. There aren't any. All we have is particulars with rough resemblances to each other, but in fact nothing the same. Nothing in common among the instances. Now you might ask on this viewpoint, should we then abandon universal terms on this view? Should we stop using words like man and game and red and subway and so on? No. Otherwise you're back in the position of Cradulus. They say no, it is convenient to use such universal words. Universal words, they say, are very convenient. Note that word. For instance, they enable us to communicate our thought simply to other people. If we have just one term to refer to a number of particulars, instead of having always to refer to each particular by a separate word, it is a great time saver, they say. And therefore, these general words are okay. Suppose, for instance, they say you wanted to communicate that Socrates, Plato, Plotinus, Tom, Dick, Harry, and so on, for a whole host of particulars like them, are mortal. Suppose you wanted to communicate that thought. Think of the time and trouble you save. Think of the convenience in being able to express all of these ideas in the statement, men are mortal, instead of having to say it separately for each one of them. So the word man here substitutes, you see, as like a shorthand device for a whole host of names of individual people. But this is the nominalist's main point. That is all that universal terms are. They are nothing but shorthand names, convenient ways of referring at the same time to a number of particulars. They're nothing but a convenient human linguistic device, like a shorthand linguistic code, just in the same way that shorthand in writing is nothing but a convenient human writing device. Now I want to emphasize this. In saying that universal terms are only human linguistic devices, the nominalist is saying that there is nothing in reality, nothing in the objective world, which requires us to classify things the way we do. There are no facts of reality, he says, which necessitate us in grouping Tom, Dick, Harry, etc. in one class and applying one term to them. There's nothing in reality, after all, in common the same among Tom, Dick, Harry, etc., which we can abstract. There are no identical common properties, remember, which justify us in grouping particulars together under one name. Now, that's precisely what they deny, that there are universals. All we sense are particulars. Each particular is unique. Reality, therefore, has nothing to say one way or the other about how we group particulars. It has nothing to say about which ones we should put together into one class to refer to by one term. Since there are no universals, classification is arbitrary. That is a central point to the nominalist. Therefore, our groupings, our classifications, merely reflect our subjective decisions. If we find it convenient to apply one term to Tom, Dick, and Harry, etc., okay. If you don't find it convenient, that's okay too, but it is up to our subjective convenience. Now, you might ask me this obvious question: why is it that certain names applied to certain groups are convenient and not applied to other groups? Why is one classification convenient and another inconvenient, if everything is in fact unique and there are no common denominators? Why couldn't I make up a term gloop and say, well, I'm going to use it as a shorthand name for the following things. The people on my left, not the ones on the right, the people on my left, and I'm going to throw in Greek philosophers, the linoleum in the north half of Manhattan, and the ships in the British Navy. And I'm going to use the word gloop to stand for anything that comes in that mixture. Now you'd say this is obviously inconvenient, right? But why? If there are no real common denominators running through various particulars, why should any one grouping be more convenient than any other? That's the question. Now the nominalists claim to have an answer to that. They say it's true that each particular is unique. There are no common denominators. Nevertheless, there are similarities or resemblances among particulars, they say. I hasten to add, rough similarities, rough resemblances. No real common denominators, but still they say there are rough resemblances. For instance, Tom, Dick, and Harry are more like each other than any one of them is to a cabbage. Now, of course, there's nothing identically in common among the three, Tom, Dick, and Harry. Each is unique in its own way, a nominalist will say, but still there are rough resemblances. Of course, there's resemblances also between them and the cabbage in various ways, but the resemblance is closer among them than between them and the cabbage. Therefore, they say it's usually more convenient to have one term for those three and others who closely resemble them than to have one term for Tom and Dick and the cabbage, because the resemblances are so much less pronounced in that case. In a word, the nominalist takes this view. Reality suggests which classifications are convenient, because it does present us with groups of more or less resembling particulars, and therefore we can explain why one classification is more convenient than others. But they insist we stick to our view that reality does not dictate any classification. It doesn't logically necessitate one classification over another. It wouldn't be wrong to put Dick and the cabbage under one term, because after all, there are some vague similarities. And it's not right or true to do it the way we do it now, because there's really nothing identically in common. Classification, and this is the mark of a true nominalist, classification is not an issue of truth or falsehood at all. It's an issue of convenience and inconvenience. It's up to us to decide, to human beings, to decide where to draw the lines, how closely two particulars must resemble each other to qualify for the same term. Our subjective human interests decide what classifications to erect upon the rough resemblances that nature gives us. So we create classes getting hints from reality, but only hints, never decisive facts. Now, this is the viewpoint that is known as nominalism. It comes from the Greek and Latin word for name, and it's the theory that universals are only names, arbitrarily imposed by human beings on roughly resembling particulars for purposes of subjective convenience. Should I repeat that? That's a formal definition. Nominalism is the view that universals are only names, arbitrarily imposed by human beings on roughly resembling particulars for the sake of subjective convenience. We simply decide, I'm going to call all the following particulars by such and such a name, and our decision to use the name a certain way is what creates the universal. Our naming procedures are the source of universals, and that's why it's called nominalism. Now, nominalism is far and away the most influential theory of universals in the modern world. It was adopted, as I say, by the major 18th century empiricists, and all major 20th century philosophers are nominalists. Pragmatists are nominalists. Logical positivists are nominalists. The analyst movement is nominalist. Existentialists are nominalists. And therefore, that's why I want to make it clear as much as I can as a background before you get drenched in the sea of nominalism, which you will be in subsequent weeks. Now, nominalism has a host of devastating philosophic consequences. Some of them were drawn in the 17th and 18th century by the empiricists of the time, but many of them remain for the 20th century to draw. Now, there are certain important consequences in particular I want to point out now. And from now on, therefore, I'm going to follow David Hume in the 18th century. He was an arch-nominalist, and the conclusions he drew from it will show you how, starting as an empiricist, going to become a nominalist, you go straight to complete skepticism. Well, let's develop this progression. To begin with, if you are a nominalist, what will your account be of the nature of man's cognitive capacities, his means of acquiring knowledge? Now, both Plato and Aristotle said that man had two different cognitive faculties, what they called sense, or sense perception, and reason. The faculty that operated by percepts and the faculty that operates by concepts. And when they were asked to specify the difference between the two, they both said, sense is directed to particulars. Reason or concepts is directed to universals. Well, what happens now if you deny universals the way the nominalists do? If all that exists are unique particulars, if there are no universals to grasp, then what is there for human consciousness to do? Well, all it can do is perceive sensorially the unique particulars. Abstraction, conceptual awareness, as a state distinct from sense perception, is now impossible because it has no object. There's no longer any common denominator for you to be aware of by a process of abstraction. There's no longer any object for conceptual as distinct from perceptual awareness. So if you're a nominalist, you will say, there is really no such thing as abstract thought or as conceptual thought. Well, then did they dismiss the word concept or idea and say there's no such thing? Well, no, most of them said what we call a concept or an idea is really nothing but a dull or fading sense experience. Or putting it in a little more modern terms, really nothing but an image, a little mental picture. Now, an image, of course, is something we can all have. And right now, I ask you, form an image of a man, a little, in this case, visual picture of a man before your eyes. Now, you will notice that you have a little faded picture before your eyes. But your image is of some particular man. It has some height, some particular age. It's either wildly obese or slim. It either has hair or it doesn't have hair. It's either smiling or it isn't smiling. It's particular as soon as you focus on every aspect of it. Now, for a nominalist, when you talk about an idea of man, there's no such thing as an abstract awareness of what's common to all men. An idea is simply this particular image. Ideas, thoughts, concepts are really only sensory images. Now, this viewpoint is called sensualism. 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 It's the epistemological result of nominalism. And it is the view that human beings really have only one cognitive capacity, namely sense perception. That conceptualization is really nothing but a form of sense perception, simply a decaying sense perception. In other words, that man has only one means of knowledge, and that is sense perception. And what we call a concept is a name really for a type of sense percept. That fading sense percept we call an image. Now, sensualism is the real reduction of man to the perceptual level mentality. It's the type that says there is really nothing in man to acquire knowledge with except the senses. And as I tried to show, it's the direct consequence of nominalism. A sensualist, therefore, holds that reason is not a source of knowledge of facts over and above sense perception. Or put it another way, if you can't learn something by sense experience, it simply can't be known. Facts are acquired by sense perception and only by sense perception. There's no such thing as reasoning on the basis of observation to acquire conclusions that you couldn't get directly from sense observation. Now, don't confuse sensualism with empiricism. Aristotle is an empiricist, but he's not a sensualist. Empiricism is simply the view that all knowledge is based on sense experience, that there's no innate ideas. Now, that leaves open the question, does man, in addition to sense perception, have a faculty of abstraction, a conceptual faculty, which can operate upon the data of sense and go on to rise to the conceptual rational level? Aristotle said yes. A sensualist says no. So you can think of a sensualist as a kind of pessimistic empiricist. He says knowledge begins with the senses and it ends with the senses. Whatever you get from the senses counts as knowledge. If you don't get it from the senses, there's no way to build on what the senses give you. Now let's go on to the next step. Let's assume that you are a nominalist and a sensualist, as David Hume was. Now let's look at the effect on what is called the theory of meaning. The theory of meaning. Now, by the meaning of a term or phrase, we mean what it stands for, what it communicates, what it refers to. A term is meaningful if it stands for something, if it has a referent. R-E-F-E-R-E-N-T, a reference, something it stands for. Now, so far, that's common sense. If I say to you, there's a gloop in the lobby, and you say, what do you mean by gloop? And I say, it doesn't stand for anything. You say it's meaningless then, if it doesn't stand for anything. So for a term to be meaningful, it must stand for something we can come in contact with. It must stand for some referent that we can know. Now ask yourself, if you are a sensualist, what kind of referent could a term have? Well, the only thing man can know is sense experiences and images, right? That's what it means to be a sensualist. All we can know are sense experiences and images. Well, we have then a simple test to determine whether a word is meaningful or not. If it stands for a sense experience or an image, then it's meaningful because it stands for something we can come in contact with, something we can know. If it doesn't stand for a sense perception or an image, then it's like the word gloop. It is meaningless. It is gibberish. It is empty noise standing for nothing. Now let me give you a formal statement of what is called the sensualist theory of meaning. And it's very simply this. Every meaningful term must be such that one can either perceive its referent directly or else form an image of it. Every meaningful term must be such that one can either perceive its referent directly or else form an image of it. If it doesn't fulfill this test, if a term is such that it doesn't stand for something you can perceive, and it doesn't stand for something you can form an image of, then a sensualist will say the word is meaningless. It's literally noise, without any sense, without any content. It's sound and fury signifying nothing. Now you might ask, can't words stand for concepts, for abstractions, as distinct from simply percepts and images? To which a sensualist will say, no. Where did you get that old-fashioned idea of concepts or abstractions? There are no concepts apart from percepts and images. Percepts and images are all we can ever know about, and therefore that's all that our words can refer to if they are to be meaningful. Now this is Hume's theory of meaning. It's one of the most influential tenets on all of 20th century philosophy, and you will see that amply when we get to pragmatism and logical positivism. They are essentially variants and developments of this particular theory of meaning, and I'll explore it more thoroughly at that time. But the net effect of it is going to be that all knowledge that depends upon concepts rather than simply sense percepts becomes literally meaningless. On this theory, it stands for nothing. Now for tonight, I want to give you just a couple of examples of how Hume himself used this theory of meaning to destroy certain fundamental philosophic concepts and therefore to lead directly to skepticism. And Hume's procedure is always the same. He takes some critical philosophic term on which life, science, and sanity depends. And then he will say, can you perceive its referent directly? And the person will stutter and say, no, I can't. And then he will say, can you form an image of it? And the person will say, no, I can't. And then Hume will say, well, then the word is simply noise. It's meaningless, stands for nothing, throw it out. Now by this process, as you will see, nothing is left. Let's take as an example his most famous use of this theory, namely his attack on cause and effect. Now you know the proposition that every event has a cause. That's the proposition we depend upon. That's the principle we depend upon when we generalize, we arrive at scientific laws, and we make predictions about the future. When you sit on that chair, you're counting on the idea there's cause and effect. This chair has a certain nature, it'll act a certain way. I can be sure if I enact the cause of a certain pressure, I'll be a certain effect, that it'll support me, etc. It's obvious in what way daily life, sanity, and science depends upon cause and effect. Now Hume sets himself to demolish the principle of cause and effect as follows. He says, what do we mean when we say one thing causes another? What do we mean by cause? To take a simple example, I take a rock and I throw it out a window. And the rock traveling across and striking the window is the cause, and then we see the fragments of glass shatter, and that's the effect. A causes B. The rock causes the shattering. What does it mean to say one thing causes the other? Well, says Hume, there are three ingredients in our use of cause. Two of them are okay, but one is no good, and that's the one that eviscerates and emasculates the whole thing. What is okay? Well, he says one thing we mean when we say A causes B is that the two events are together in space, directly connected in space. The rock hits the window and the window immediately shatters. And that's okay, that's meaningful. We can directly observe spatial togetherness, one thing directly contacting another. So that's meaningful because we can have a percept of it. A second thing that is included in the idea of cause is that the cause and effect have to be directly together in time. The window shatters immediately after the rock strikes it. And again, says Hume, the idea of temporal contact is completely meaningful. We can directly observe one thing and then instantly the other. So again, even as sensualists, that's meaningful. But now, of course, spatial and temporal togetherness is not yet enough to explain what people think they mean by cause and effect. Suppose I just lightly touched this mechanism. I'm right directly in contact with it in space. And at the instant I touched it, the whole room exploded. The normal person would say, well, just because it's directly connected in space and time, that doesn't mean there's a causal connection. That was simply a coincidence. A coincidence is what we call it when two events happen to go together directly, but there is no causal connection. Well, then asks Hume, what is required to distinguish a real causal connection from simply a coincidence? And his answer is the third ingredient in the causal concept, namely, there must be a necessary connection. That's his expression. A necessary connection between the two events. When you say that one thing causes another, you mean given the first, the second must happen. The first makes the second happen. The first necessitates the second. And that's really, and he's correct, that's the core of the causal concept. The necessity, the iron link between cause and effect. That's the heart of it. Well now, says Hume, what about this expression, necessary connection? Did anybody ever perceive necessity? What does it look like? Is necessity green? Is it rough? Is it noisy? What? Can anybody form an image of necessity? Now, it doesn't count to form an image of the letter NEC, etc. That's just forming images of shapes, but images of necessity. Now, for instance, suppose that as the rock were about to strike the window, a little flag came out of the side of the rock and said, the next event has got to happen. Well, that you might call a sensory experience of necessity, but no little flag comes out. As the rock strikes the window, no voice booms from the sky, que sera, sera. Right? We have no sensory experience, says Hume, of necessary connection. We have no image of necessary connection. All we observe is one thing and then another thing. We observe that one thing happens and then another happens, but we never observe that it must happen. We can have no experience of a must, says Hume. What conclusion must we come to then? Shouldn't have used that word. What conclusion do we come to then about the word must or its synonyms, necessity, and so on? Says Hume, they are meaningless. They are meaningless because they refer to something that is neither perceivable nor imageable. Well, if this is the case, what happens to the law of cause and effect? And the answer is, when the vital ingredient of necessary connection has been made meaningless, it collapses. Why do people have this superstition then, that there is cause and effect, when in fact necessary connection is just like gloop, doesn't mean anything? And Hume's answer is this. In the past, we have observed events going together in pairs repeatedly. And we have, in effect, a hyperactive associative mechanism. Because every time we watch somebody throw a rock and hit a window, the window shattered, we come absolutely irrationally to associate those two events together. And therefore, we come to expect that the next time we do it, the same thing will happen. But, says Hume, repeated conjunction in the past doesn't prove anything about the future. That it was repeated so many times in the past is simply a long run of coincidence. since there is no necessity, or to be more exact, necessity is a meaningless term. You have to think of it like this. Imagine, for instance, you had a sadistic mother. And from the time you were very young, every time you sat down to drink a glass of orange juice, your mother crept up behind you, and she had a huge strap, and she would wallop the table right behind you and make a huge thwacking noise. So you leap in the air. And this happens regularly, repeatedly, time after time. Those two events go together. Well, at a certain point, Hume would say you get conditioned, you see. And whenever, even if you're at a restaurant and an adult now, you're drinking orange juice, you're there waiting for the smack to come behind you. But of course, there's no causal connection. There's no necessary connection. It just happened to happen many times. Now, for Hume, every causal connection, so-called, is in that category. It has happened repeatedly in the past, but that's simply the past. There's no necessary connection, or rather that phrase is meaningless, and therefore we have no reason to assume that because it's happened in the past, it's going to happen in the future. How do we know, says Hume, that the coincidences that have held up to now are going to hold in the future? Well, he answers, there's no basis at all. Now, of course, if we could arrive at laws of reality, necessary laws, okay. But since necessity is out, all we can do is gaze blindly at the experiences that we've had up to now, and we haven't a clue as to what's going to happen in the future. Now, notice, Hume is not simply saying that it is not certain that the patterns that held in the past will hold in the future. He is saying we don't have any reason at all to give even a grain of probability to the idea that past sequences will hold in the future. Because, you see, we've wiped out any necessary connection and therefore left ourselves with just blind coincidences. So, for instance, if you throw a penny in the air, what is the chance, if you're a Humean, that it's going to come down heads or tails? Well, one chance out of infinity. Now, in the past, of course, when you threw it up, it always came down, but that's the past. And since there's no necessity and that's simply a coincidence, what else might happen? Well, you just have to have a Humean imagination. Maybe the penny will go straight up when you throw it and just vanish through the ceiling. Now, of course, it didn't do that in the past, but there was no necessity about the way it behaved in the past. It might just sit there in midair and hover. And there's an endless, limitless number of other things it could do. It could turn into Hegel and start dancing the cha-cha, etc. Now, this has given rise to what is called the problem of induction. And the problem of induction is, how can you possibly generalize and therefore predict the future if you can't count upon the sequences in the past repeating themselves in the future? To which Hume says there is no answer at all. Generalization, he claims, is irrational. Assuming that the future will be like the past is irrational. Predicting the future on the basis of the past is irrational. I've even heard Humeans say that the statistical probability is that the whole world is going to go wild at any instant because it's been so well behaved up to now, but that simply is a coincidence. Now, I hope you see in what way that whole assault on cause and effect rests upon the attack on necessity, on necessary connection, which in turn depends upon his sensualism, which in turn depends upon his nominalism. And so you end up with Hume's universe. Nothing necessitates anything. As he puts it, all events are, quote, loose and separate. Anything can follow anything. Anything can happen. There's no order, no law, no intelligibility. It's a universe of brute, inexplicable, unintelligible sense experiences. Period. Now, the technical name for this idea that there is no necessity in the universe is the statement that everything is contingent, a word you should know, contingent. Contingent, as philosophers use the term, means something which happens to be so, but is devoid of necessity, which does not have to be so, which is just a brute, unexplained matter of fact, and which is therefore, of course, completely unreliable, because you never know how long it'll hold. Now, this viewpoint is crucial for a good deal of contemporary philosophy. It's a very common viewpoint to say No facts necessitate or imply any other facts. The world is just a heap of non-rational occurrences. Everything is independent of everything else. There is no necessity, no law, just a universe of brute, contingent facts. Now that is the legacy that Hume bequeathed to subsequent philosophy, and you will see in how many different ways it is accepted by later philosophers. Now, Hume accepted this denial of necessity in reality across the board. And I want to point out one more area in which he drew disastrous conclusions from. Again, to prepare you for Kant, who claims that he's going to answer Hume. Hume used his denial of necessity to support Heraclitus' view that there are no entities. He used the denial of necessity to declare that there are no entities. How? Well, what is an entity? Well, the philosophers prior to Hume had said that an entity is a thing which has a number of different qualities which are necessarily bound together to make up one enduring thing. Now, for instance, consider this cigarette. It has a number of distinguishable characteristics. A certain color, a certain size, a certain shape, a certain temperature, the tip is hot, a certain texture, it's smooth, and so on. All of these different qualities that I just enumerated go along together, and together they make up this cigarette. Now, prior to Hume, philosophers had held that the qualities that make up an entity have a necessary connection to one another, that they couldn't exist separately from each other. They couldn't split apart, but were necessarily bound into a unity, which was the entity. Now, of course, you would expect that Hume denies this. There is no necessity, or rather, necessity is a meaningless word. And therefore, there is no reason, he says, why the qualities that happen to go together now to make up what we call an entity shouldn't suddenly split apart, disintegrate, so that instead of an entity, we merely have a succession of disjointed qualities. For instance, according to Hume, there's nothing to prevent the qualities that make up this cigarette from suddenly splitting apart from each other and showing up in different parts of this room. After all, there is no necessity. Everything is a brute, contingent fact. So, for instance, you could imagine the white color over on my left. You can see a little white patch here. But you try to touch it, can't feel anything. There's no tactile qualities, just the visual quality. No temperature over here, just the visual quality. Whereas, on the other hand, on my right, you can reach out and feel the smooth texture, only you don't see anything. Only the texture is over here. And suppose in front of my nose, there's simply a hot burning point, the temperature, but without any texture, without any color, etc. Now, according to Hume, this state of affairs is perfectly possible. After all, nothing in reality is necessary. What we call an entity is simply a cluster of independent qualities, which happen to go together for a while, but there's no necessity in this. What we call an entity is simply a loose bundle of qualities, a loose collection, which can at any instant disintegrate and leave us in a universe of floating qualities, but no things, no unified, integrated entity. Now, says Hume, this is not just a theoretical projection on my part, he says. It happens all the time. It's just that people don't notice it. They don't pay careful attention. In fact, he says, if you go by what you really perceive, you never perceive enduring entities. All you ever perceive is constantly shifting sets or bundles of qualities, constantly changing their partners. Suppose, for instance, I'm walking down the street, and I'm looking at the Empire State Building, and I'm coming from the north, let us say. Now, most people, the non-Humeans, believe that that Empire State Building is a certain enduring combination of qualities, that they can look at it, look away, look back, and see the same set, the same size, the same shape, the same color, the same enduring thing. Hume says, go by actual experience, you never see the same set of qualities, or very rarely. You see a new bundle each time. For instance, you get closer, and what happens to the size? It gets bigger. The sun comes out, and what happens to the color? Suddenly a part which was black becomes gray or becomes white, depending upon the sun. You pass under it, and what happened to the shape? It's radically different as you actually experience it from what it was 2 blocks away. Your eye darts to the spire, and you see one shape, and then to the base, and you see a different shape, etc., etc. Well, says Hume, what we really experience, therefore, is a succession of different bundles of qualities, constantly changing. Now, what we call an entity is really simply because we're too lazy to notice the radical changes that this thing is constantly undergoing. All we really get is a loose collection of shifting qualities. Now, of course, the people who don't agree with Hume hear this and they object at once. This is all crazy. Of course, they're right. But show you where the rest of his philosophy comes in here. You would say, isn't Hume confusing 2 entirely different things? Don't you have to distinguish the entity which endures from our changing forms of perceiving it, our changing perspectives on it? So you would object the entity is one thing. It is what it is, and it isn't affected by our varying perceptual conditions. And you'd say all you have to do to answer Hume and discover a stable entity in reality, therefore, is what? Abstract away from our changing experiences. Abstract away from the changes that we introduce and form a concept of the entity as it is independently of our forms of perceiving it. But of course, if Hume heard that, what would he say? Abstract away? Form a concept? There are no such things. All we have, all we can know is the stream of sense data that go by. That, of course, is his sensualism. If this stream constantly changes, if we don't sense an enduring entity, then the idea is meaningless. If we go by sense data, sense experiences alone, we have to conclude that there are no entities. There is simply a Heraclitean flux of sensory qualities, constantly shifting, changing, appearing, disappearing. Well, the upshot is that Hume's universe is completely shattered, completely disintegrated. There are no entities to unite qualities into enduring wholes. There are no causal connections to unite events into chains. We have just a shifting, kaleidoscopic flux of disparate sensory qualities which belong to no entities and obey no laws. All we can know is the sensation of the moment as it passes our eyes. And that, of course, is just what you would expect from a sensualist who denies man's power of conceptualization. Well, then we're reduced to simply contemplating an unintelligible stream of sense data. Now I want to clarify one point here before we conclude for this evening. You might ask me, well, does Hume really say that nothing is necessary? Does he say that every truth is contingent, unreliable, liable to prove false the next moment? Aren't there, you might ask, some truths which are absolutely necessary, so that even Hume can't get away from it? To which Hume answers, in essence, yes, I concede that certain truths are necessary. But, and this is a pregnant but, they won't do you any good. Because, he says, they say nothing about reality, nothing about facts. Now this brings us to the last point of Hume that you have to know. And that is his famous distinction between 2 types of truths. What he calls matters of fact, on the one hand, versus relations of ideas, on the other. matters of fact versus relations of ideas. Now, this distinction, although not originated by Hume, was put forth very powerfully by him and is overwhelmingly influential on Kant. This is what becomes in Kant the analytic-synthetic dichotomy with everything that implies. It is virtually gospel among the great majority of 20th century philosophers, and so you have to know at least an idea of it at this stage to get us into Kant next week. Now, what does Hume mean by this distinction? By matter of fact, he means any statement which tells you that something is actually the case in the world. Any statement that describes facts or that pertains to reality. For instance, there are many mountains around Denver, or unsupported objects fall, or there's a number of people in this room tonight, etc. Now, statements such as these, statements that claim to describe actual facts, he holds, are never necessary. Because remember, no facts are necessary. These statements are one and all contingent. That is to say, they happen to be true, but they do not have to be so, and at any moment they can be upset. The mountains around Denver might suddenly vanish. Unsupported objects might suddenly start sitting still in midair. The people here might suddenly vanish. About these truths, he claims, logic has nothing to say. You can't arrive at these truths by reasoning because there's nothing necessary about them. They are simply brute, non-logical, unintelligible facts. And, says Hume, you can easily imagine their opposites. You can easily imagine that they wouldn't hold true. How do we know these propositions to be true? Strictly by experience, he claims. The only way we know they remain true at any moment is by having more experience to check them. Now, these kind of truths are what philosophers call empirical truths, or a posteriori truths. A posteriori. It's posterior with an I on it and an A before it. A posteriori. And a posteriori simply means dependent on experience. Now, all matters of fact, says Hume, depend on experience and are therefore a posteriori. That simply means empirical, dependent on experience. They are one and all contingent, non-logical, devoid of necessity, unintelligible, brute, unreliable. On the other hand, consider now from the other column a statement like bachelors are male, or triangles have three sides, or 2 + 2 = 4. Now, these are examples of what Hume calls relations of ideas rather than matters of fact. And these, he says, are necessary. They're not contingent. You can count on them. They're reliable, but why? Because, he says, they say nothing whatever about reality. They say nothing about facts. They are true simply because of human beings' arbitrary definitions. Given our arbitrary definition of bachelor, he says, you can know that all bachelors are male and that they have to be male. But that's because being male is part of the arbitrary definition of the word bachelor. We have arbitrarily decided to use the word bachelor in such a way that if a thing isn't male, we won't call it a bachelor. But that doesn't tell us, he says, anything about reality. It simply tells us how we have arbitrarily decided to use words. Even if there were no bachelors, it would still be true because of the way we use words. In other words, he says, necessary truths are necessary because we make them so. If they were about the world, we could never know that they were necessary. The reason we can know that they're necessary is because we legislate them into existence by our arbitrary linguistic usage. So, for instance, if you want, I'll create a Humean necessary truth before your eyes. I'll say, I'm going to arbitrarily define gloop as a horse which likes roses. Well, now I'll create the following necessary truth. All groups like roses. And that has to be true because I'm using the word goop to stand for a horse which likes roses. Now, doesn't tell me anything about reality, says Hume, but all definitional statements, he says, are in that exact category. They're simply relations of ideas. Given that we're going to use an idea a certain way, we can express a certain statement using it. This type of statement, however, is detached from reality altogether, and therefore we don't have to validate it by reference to experience. They are independent of experience, and the name for this is they are a priori. A priori, as philosophers use it, means independent of experience. And according to Hume, everything which depends upon definition, including all the truths of mathematics, fall into this class. They're necessary, but empty, non-factual, cut off from reality, simply a product of man's arbitrary use of definitions. So you're given this choice by Hume. If you say, I'm certain about a given proposition, I know that it must be true, it's necessary and reliable, Hume says, well, if so, then it is not about the world, it says nothing about facts, it just expresses your linguistic conventions. On the other hand, if a statement says something about facts, by that sheer fact, it is contingent, uncertain, unreliable. Put it like this, if you establish a statement by experience, it's contingent and unreliable. If you establish it by logical reasoning, it's arbitrary and a matter of human linguistic convention. So you're trapped either way. If you prove something to be necessary, it's detached from facts. If you can't prove it, it's contingent, and who knows how long it will continue. We're led to complete skepticism. Now, this dichotomy I'd like you to be familiar with and understand. It's picked up by Kant. Hume, as I say, did not originate it, but it was picked up by Kant. It's absolutely indispensable as the basis of his philosophy, and I will review in the next lecture this from Kant's point of view and show you how he developed it into what came to be the analytic-synthetic distinction. Well, I think you can now see the overall effect of Hume's philosophy. Philosophy has reached a state of complete bankruptcy. On the one hand, we have the rationalists with their floating constructs and systems. On the other hand, the empiricists with Hume, watching sense experience go by unintelligibly, unable to understand or make any sense out of the universe. Well, what happens now? That is the point where Kant enters the scene and says, I am going to once and for all untangle the whole picture and provide the definitive resolution of all the problems up to this point. Now, as far as we are concerned this evening, I think you've had enough background, certainly as much as I could pack into one evening. And if you think of it, we've accomplished a great deal this evening. We invalidated man's conceptual faculty, reduced him to the perceptual level, wiped out entities, wiped out the law of cause and effect, turned all necessary truths into conventions. I think we've done enough damage for one night. So try to absorb this much now, and you'll be ready for the next onslaught next week when you get Kant. Thank you very much. Now I have a few written questions that I'll start with. Do you think Hume can be viewed as a rationalist who was led to skepticism by what he thought was a lack of evidence, rather than the traditional view which pegs him as an empiricist? No, I do not. Yes, he thought there was a lack of evidence for cause and effect and entities and so on, but he thought there was a lack of evidence because he was a sensualist who based, whose conception of evidence was the knowledge that you can get directly from sense experience. And anybody who takes that foundation is, in my view, obviously an empiricist, not a rationalist. As I use the term rationalism, is the view that reason independent of sense experience can acquire knowledge, and I see nothing whatever to validate that interpretation of Hume. Another written one. Isn't Hume's philosophy an abstraction? If so, how does he deal with that fact? And I think the implication of that question is perfectly valid. I think, if you ask me, the only consistent skeptic is Cratylus, because he simply stopped speaking. Now, that is an impregnable position. If you don't say anything, nobody can refute you. But if you are going to make an all-out assault on everything that human knowledge depends upon, you cannot claim it as knowledge. And that includes, if you're going to make an all-out assault on abstractions, you can't employ them. And therefore, I think the thrust of this question is perfectly valid. I might say that Hume himself declared that it is impossible to live by his philosophy. He declared that he would write his philosophy and think it was perfectly fine, and then go out to dinner and play a game of backgammon with his friends and forget altogether about his philosophy, and he'd get out of the way of trucks. Of course, they didn't have them in the 18th century, but the equivalent, and live, in a way depending upon cause and effect and entities and reality and so on. And then he said he would come back and read his writings, and they seemed strained and ridiculous to him and impossible to live by. And then, of course, he would get sucked back into his own argumentation, and he was therefore a very tortured individual. But he himself said that you have to, that you can't live by this philosophy. But he didn't regard that as an objection. He said you can't live by any philosophy. And therefore he was one of the fathers of 20th century irrationalism, because he drew the conclusion that you have to live by irrational or non-rational instinct. Simply discard ideas which are all a game, impractical, and follow your instinct. And if you know anything about subsequent philosophy, you know what the existentialists and the Nazis, to take just two groups, made of that viewpoint. So much for that question. Do I have one from the floor? Yes, sir.
Does Hume, by denying the law of cause and effect, not only denies man the ability of knowledge, to gain knowledge, but also implies that man has some form of innate idea?
Why would it imply that? You're suggesting that the denial of cause and effect implies some form of innate ideas. Why?
Because he has to know something to deny the actual cause, the law of cause and effect, and yet he denies knowledge. And
well, but he would claim that he would claim, though, that he denies the law of cause and effect not on the basis of innate ideas, but simply on the basis that he can't find any ground for it in sense experience. And therefore he would say it's not knowledge that makes him deny it, but the lack of knowledge. But you see, what he conceives as knowledge is simply evidence of the senses, and since he can't perceive a necessary connection, it follows that...
but wouldn't that be wiped out by denying the law of cause and effect, or sense perception?
In what way? You mean...
that you have to perceive something, and the cause is...
Well, but Hume would deny that. You see, he was consistent in this respect. He says it's not the case that you have to think of sense perception as an entity out there operating upon your mind and producing certain effects in you. Yeah, there's not his interpretation of sense experience. He contests that on three grounds. There's no entities out there. There is no cause and effect, so even if they existed, they wouldn't have any effects on you. And the third point, which I left out, is there's no you. I left that out of the lecture, but he also holds that. And therefore he would throw out that model that you put completely on all counts. If you asked Hume, well, but then how do you explain sensations? Where do they come from? His answer would be they just are. There's no explanation you can give to where sensations come from. It just happens to be a brute, contingent fact that a stream of sense data go by. Where they come from, you can't ask. There's no such thing as causality. Who experiences them, you can't ask. There's no you to do the experiencing. Why they follow the sequences they do, you can't ask. Will they follow those sequences tomorrow? Who knows? That's the Humean viewpoint. Yes, sir.
You said that the seeds of modern linguistic analysts can be found in you.
Can you say that the seeds of modern linguistic analysts are found in Hume? Yes, you certainly can. He is one of the philosophers that they most like, But for details on that, wait till the lecture on linguistic analysis, because you will see there. But among many other things, one thing which is absolutely central to them is the view that every matter of fact is contingent, and that therefore necessity is simply a linguistic matter. Now, Hume himself didn't originate the idea that necessity is linguistic. That's also found in Hobbes and other people. But he is the most influential one. And generally you will find that the contemporaries have great admiration for Hume, and their philosophies are actually variants on his combined with Kant. Yes? Well, in a certain way, you can take it much further back than Hume. You can take it to Hobbes. There were nominalists all the way back in the ancient world. There were skeptics in the ancient world who were nominalists. But in terms of a major influence, you'd have to say Hume was the big turning point, because they were regarded, in effect, as cranks prior to Hume. He's the one that gave it a kind of major respectability, skepticism, and who made the major problem of philosophy, how do you answer Hume? And then Kant attempted to do it in his way. I won't anticipate. I'll wait until next time. Let me take a couple of written ones. There's one here that I simply have to bypass. It asks me to present the objectivist theory of sense perception. I say some things about that in the lecture on objectivism at the end, and I couldn't. What he really wants in this question is a summary of everything I said in the last lecture of the ancient philosophy course from Thales to Hume. And I wouldn't have any idea how to summarize that, since I think I talked nonstop for an hour and 20 minutes trying to condense in just the essentials of the objectivist view on that question against the background of all the theories of sense perception we discussed in that course, and it's simply impossible to condense it here. Another question I have here: what is wrong with Aristotle's view that universals exist in the particulars? Again, I say something about that in the last lecture, but you can, for now, I think, see simply certain problem with it. If each particular is composed of two elements, the universal element, which is what we grasp by the conceptual faculty, and the individuating element, well then, what is the nature of the individuating element? If it has any characteristics, it immediately becomes conceptualizable. So it would be grasped by the conceptual faculty. But if it's to be absolutely unique, the element which individuates, it can't share any characteristics with any other thing, which means it can't be conceptualized, which means it can't be known by the human mind. And Aristotle himself is forced to the view of saying that the element which makes a thing unique is unknowable by the human mind, that it in itself has no distinct characteristics. Now that is obviously an untenable position, and therefore that's just simply a small indication of the fact that you cannot construe particulars as composed metaphysically of two elements, the individuating part and the universalizing part, because it makes half the particular unknowable, among many other reasons. How to construe universals in their relationship to particulars correctly, and how the objectivist position differs, is something I cover in the end of this course when we have several lectures on, 2 lectures on the objectivist philosophy. Yes?
Since you've discussed universals and also the question of induction, could you point to the relationship between that?
What is the relationship between the problem of universals and the problem of induction? Well, obviously, the problem of induction presupposes a solution to the problem of universals. The general distinction between the two is that the problem of universals is supposed to be how do we validate our concepts or abstractions, individual terms, for instance, man, mortal, red, color, etc. The problem of induction is how do you validate general propositions, full propositions like all men are mortal, all alcohol intoxicates, etc. Now, obviously, a precondition of validating generalizations, the problem of induction, is the ability to validate individual concepts. You'd first have to be able to say what a concept is and how it relates to particulars. Then you could go on to specify what are the rules under which you can combine concepts in such a way as to justify a generalization. That would be a separate assignment over and above, but first you would have to validate concepts. So I would say a valid theory of concepts would give you the key to a solution to to the problem of induction. But then the problem of induction itself, you have to divide into two sub-aspects. One is the question, why is it ever justified to generalize? That's the Humean question. If something happens a zillion times, every man up to now has been mortal, why does it follow that he will be in the future? To solve that problem, you have to obviously be able to defend cause and effect and show that there are laws in reality. And the objectivist view on that I discuss, I think, a couple of weeks from now. But then, assuming you've established the law of cause and effect, that still leaves open the question, how do you know in a particular case that you have generalized correctly? Even assuming that there are universal laws, how do you know the instances you have observed are instances of them, and that therefore you've got a proper sample and are justified in generalizing? And as I recall, there's a discussion of that also later in the course. Yes?
Is the nominalist doctrine of rough similarities a stolen concept?
If you ask me, the nominalist doctrine of rough similarities is certainly a stolen concept, if that is your question, because I would ask, among many other questions, and I say something critical of nominalism later in the course, but just briefly here, what is meant by similarity? Now, I would define similarity. Two things are similar when they are in certain respects the same and in certain respects different. That is, similarity, I would say, is partially identity and partial difference. You and I are similar because we have certain things the same and certain things different. Now, they take similarity as an irreducible primary, and therefore I say they take it in a way without any justified definition to the concept. But you would be amazed how consistent nominalists are within the framework of their own theory. For instance, it was common for opponents of nominalists to say, well, you are at least granting one universal, namely similarity or resemblance. You're saying that similarity or resemblance runs identically through everything, and therefore you've conceded at least one universal. And the nominalists come back immediately, oh no, we don't even believe that similarity is the same. And I heard one nominalist say, for instance, take the similarity between three oranges, on the one hand, and the similarity between three colonels, in the army, on the other hand. Now, is the similarity between the oranges the same as the similarity between the colonels? No, they're just similar to each other, but they're not really the same, and therefore even similarity is not the same. Now, I mean, they'll go that far. So, but the basic objectivist view on nominalism I reserve for when I present the objectivist position. If you're familiar, just to indicate without explanation the objectivist point of what is wrong with the false dichotomy of the subjective versus the intrinsic. If you're familiar with that, and I'm counting right for this answer on your having read about that, because I do develop that in the lecture on objectivism in this course. But if you're familiar, you will see that the Aristotelian and Platonist position amount to saying that universals are intrinsic in things. And the nominalist position amounts to saying that universals are subjective. And the objectivist position, of course, is that universals are neither of those. They are objective. But what exactly that means and how that's developed is formally discussed in, I think it's the last lecture of the course. Yes, at the back.
You implied that Hume was disappointed that his philosophy was not liberal. Second point, it sounded like Hume explains what the Zen Buddhists are trying to do.
Well, wait, is your first point a question or just an observation?
Now we're going to pull the two together.
Yeah.
Suppose philosophy is not a way of life, but rather philosophy is a road that leads you to the point that you conclude that you must experience Zen enlightenment satori.
Well, could you just give me the question, because I'm not sure what you're asking. Is philosophy a road that leads to the experience of satori? Is that the question?
Leads one to the conclusion that he must experience satori.
That certainly is not. If you're asking me, is that philosophy, my answer is unequivocal, categorical no. It is not my or the objectivist concept of philosophy that it's a road to lead to a mystic trance into an ineffable dimension. Now, I will have something to say about Zen Buddhism as the tag end of the lecture on existentialism. But if you want simply a flat statement in advance, I consider that embarrassing that we have reached the stage where any lecture on philosophy should even include a reference to such a phenomenon as Zen Buddhism, let alone that that's the goal of philosophy. I do not regard mystic trances as evidence for or indication of anything about the universe except one thing. Namely, a person who authentically has it is in serious trouble. Now, you see, there's two interpretations of mystic trances. There are those who hold that mystic trances reveal a supernatural reality, and those who hold that they represent a psychological aberration, and that they require a cure, not an audience. You know, I take that what you can call the psychiatric interpretation of the mystic experience. Yes?
And your statement that philosophy is a way of life, is that a definitional premise?
No, the statement that philosophy is a way of life is not a definition of philosophy. Philosophy is a subject of knowledge. It has many branches, and it investigates certain specific questions for the sake of coming to certain answers. And then, given those answers, if you live in accordance with them, you will enact a certain way of life in accordance with your philosophy. But philosophy as such is a subject, and its branches are metaphysics, which tells you the nature of the universe as a whole; epistemology, which tells you the means of acquiring knowledge, and in any rational epistemology excludes mystic trances; ethics, which provides a code of values to guide human choices and actions, a code which is based on your view of the nature of the universe and your means of knowledge, in other words, on metaphysics and epistemology; and then politics, which defines the proper nature and functions of government, which is the application of ethics to social political questions. There are other branches, but those are the central ones. And when you put them all together, you have a philosophy.
Still, you're working under the presumption that you have to develop a philosophy and then live in accord with that philosophy.
That's correct. So?
What about the idea that you don't need to develop a philosophy first? All you need is this experience of enlightenment.
Well, I think I've said enough to cover that. I don't believe there is such a phenomenon as a mystic experience except as an aberration, and consequently I couldn't entertain the question, is it sufficient to replace philosophy? When you enter into the case of mystic, ineffable experiences of a supernatural dimension, by that fact you remove yourself from the possibility of objective communication. If it's ineffable, you have to follow the lead of Cratylus, who had the right position with regard to the ineffable. You just can't talk about it. Yes?
During the last course, it was basically a fight between the Sophists and the Platonists.
Right.
Will we see this expanding, and if so, who's on which side?
During the last course, he says, that is, the course from Thales to Human was basically a fight between the skeptics who were in the early Greek period called the Sophists versus the Platonists. Will we see this fight continuing, and if so, who's on what side? Well, you see this fight continuing, but you see it continuing in a different sort of form. How will I put it briefly? The sophist, the skeptic side, progressively gets the upper hand. Kant, you will see, is the fusion of the worst elements of Plato combined with the worst elements of skepticism. So he is kind of the perfect synthesis of the two worst trends in preceding philosophy. And he gives rise correspondingly to the two types of school. Hegel will represent more the Platonist continuation, and the positivists and the pragmatists and the analysts will represent more the skeptical continuation. But you will see in spades the development as we continue. Now, I think I have time for one more, as this is directly on the question. Yes?
Does Hume's idea that your sense perception is just there,
Yes.
and that there's no you, relates to Plato's world of forms?
How?
in that it's supposed to be the perfect thing. I mean, it's right there. It's a perfect form.
Which is the perfect form?
Well, the sense perception, it's an absolute in...
Well, no, nothing is an absolute for a human.
Sense perception.
Yes, your sense experiences are there, but they're supposed to be particular and in constant flux, whereas Plato's forms are supposed to be perfect, abstract, motionless universals. So I don't see any connection.
Reflective and part of...
Well, you can look at it this way, if you want. Hume is Plato without the world of forms. In other words, you're plunged back in a chaotic, Heraclitean, unintelligible flux. If you want to look at it that way, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll draw a line here. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 2.